You ready?
Yes, mate.
Are we doing this? Great. Hello and welcome back to the Signal Over Noise podcast, where we help you figure out what is important to you and how to get it done effectively. Today's episode is something different, a book review that aims to see what we can learn from the Dutch historian and moral philosopher Rutger Bregman and his new work, Moral Ambition, Stop Wasting Your Talent and Start Making a Difference. I'd written, unfortunately, Sam's been lost to the Isles of Scilly on holiday, presumably off wasting his talents, but here he is in the room.
Hello. Yeah, quite a lot of wasting my talents, chasing seals and Iron Age settlements and stargazing. Actually, yeah. Yeah, quite. Saw the Rings of Saturn, which was honestly breathtaking, and it's
That's
ridiculous.
wild. What were they doing in the Isles of Scilly?
Yeah, quite. Thank you.
No, but that's
But yeah,
mental. How did that happen?
mate, it was silly. Like they had these two telescopes that on this tiny island, 100 and something people live there, and just so happened that the week we were there was the dark sky week. Also happened it was a full moon, so there wasn't really any dark sky. But these two telescopes, one of them was trained on Saturn, and you could see the rings cut through. It was monochrome, black and white, but you could see the rings as they crossed the face of Saturn, and they were just getting almost like a 45-degree angle. It was just insane. Never seen that before.
So that's
in the
cool.
flesh.
Yeah, because obviously it's still, it's not the naked eye, it's the enhanced eye because it's a really blooming long way away and our eyes aren't that good. But yeah, I've never seen anything other than a photo or something the same size as all the other stars in the sky that somebody has pointed out to me and said, look, there's Saturn. And it just looks like all the other stars. Well, looks like the stars. Anyway,
Come on,
that's
dude.
awesome.
You live in New Zealand.
Yeah, there's just every night, there's just so much of the Milky Way on display. If it's not cloudy, it's so awesome. Anyway, yeah, bunker in New Zealand, but get one above ground with windows and, I don't know, access to community and other people. I recommend. Anyway, so yeah, you've not been able to read this book. I have, but I'm going to introduce the author a little bit first because I'd not heard of Rutger Bregman before, so perhaps many of you haven't either. So he's a 37-year-old Dutch popular historian and author of 3 previous books. He sold plenty of copies of one called Humankind. He's also a big believer in what he's preaching and in this non-fiction self-help book that's all about using historical stories to illustrate the importance and feasibility of doing important stuff well. He's gone ahead and rather impressively founded a school of moral ambition in the Netherlands and had a legally binding contract written up that compels him to give away 100% of the profits from this book to that school of moral ambition. And he's stood down from the board and basically extricated himself from the School of Moral Ambition so that it can be run by his co-founders instead. Sounds like he's a pretty decent dude that's not just obviously grifting and just trying to shill you a book on doing good, but actually it's a book on making him money, thinly veiled do good. Anyway, this podcast hopefully is going to be of use to you because it's going to focus on extracting some valuable, short and snappy insights from this book that we can apply to our lives to make them meaningful and productive without sort of treading too much on his toes and using too many of his interesting historical anecdotes that he uses to sort of dress up and build and make his points. Anyway, yeah, so that's that. The book starts out by outlining a 2x3 grid, which you can sort of imagine in your head. 2 on the x-axis, is your work ambitious? Yes or no? And then on your y-axis, you've got 3 squares. You've got 3 levels of morality. At the top, you've got morally good. In the middle, you've got a neutral job or, entrepreneurship. And then at the bottom, you've got morally bad. Some examples of things that would be morally ambitious. So sort of top and over to the right-hand side in my mind. Morally ambitious would be maybe a cancer researcher. And then maybe morally bad and unambitious. In the bottom left, you would have, say, somebody working in a corner shop selling cigarettes or, I don't know, meth to children. So that'd be both unambiguously morally bad and unambitious. And I like this frame because it presents an exciting opportunity. If you're a solo entrepreneur or indeed an entrepreneur of any kind, you do get to choose at the outset what box you're going to insert yourself into. Will you develop a service or product that does good, one that brings joy, happiness, or longevity? or one that removes pain, suffering, and disease. Or perhaps you'll choose to have a morally neutral or agnostic product that may sell well, but cannot really in any plausible manner really be described as making a positive difference or a negative impact in the world. In that case, you could perhaps bolt on some things like becoming a B Corp or giving away some of your money that proceeds to sort of lever yourself up into the sort of morally ambitious, if it's an ambitious product that is neither moral or immoral. So I really like that frame, and I think it's quite a useful one through which we can look at our projects and how we utilize our time. He then goes on to explain that lots of us are lured into boxes such as unambitious and immoral by pay premiums, or ambitious but morally neutral, again, usually by things like money, prestige, and security. And none of these things are to be sniffed at, of course. They're significant factors in decision-making frameworks for most of us. But Rutger argues that we need to focus on meaning, and that we will most reliably find a sense of meaning in the moral and ambitious box. I might suggest that a morally neutral job, one in which you've done extensive research to rule out the possibility of it being bad, that provides safety and security for you and your loved ones, is still worth doing. But maybe that's me being unambitious. Yeah. What do you think so far?
Yeah, so I'm curious. I guess that particular point is quite pertinent, isn't it? Because I feel like if you are in a role or a job that has no negative moral impact and is incredibly neutral, you confirmed that you've taken a step back and plotted exactly where you are in that matrix. If you're providing for your family, let's say, perhaps that is actually pushing the needle slightly towards the morally ambitious, because do you know what? It's a tough world out there. We have to put food on the table or not. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that you might argue that it's moral, but not particularly ambitious. And I think that's okay. Like, a lot of people acting in a way that is moral and not particularly ambitious is wonderful. If some people then have the opportunity to then sort of, pour some rocket fuel or jet fuel on the bonfire and do something, convert it into something that's both. And perhaps it's through scale, or perhaps it's, you're slowly accumulating wealth, and then you can deploy that money that you've saved up through your career to do something that's, worthwhile and ambitious. Or maybe, I don't know, you give it all away to the cat sanctuary when you're dead. If you can avoid giving it all to the government, then that if that's what you believe is a morally good thing to be doing, then it's pretty heckin' ambitious to give away all of your accumulated wealth at your death. So yeah, that was it. And then he went on to sort of further substantiate that point by pointing out or claiming that 40% of Harvard graduates go into consulting, meaning that they make money without committing to making the world a better place. Consultants are essentially these guns for hire that aim to improve the efficiency of a system. Say one that sells airline tickets, or delivers sanitized water to homes, or develops lethal unmanned weaponry drones. If you choose this popular route that pays really well and is quite prestigious, then you will essentially have no control over whether your intelligence and productivity and competence is used for good, bad, or nothing of either. So that's interesting. These are financially ambitious people who over-index on financial inducements and job perks, and under-index on the life satisfaction that can come from meaningful pursuit of something morally good. And these jobs tend to lack feedback loops, which maybe you can speak on a bit more, that allow you to feel connected to the outcomes of your labor.
Yeah, I was actually taken aback there, because I am a consultant and have been since I graduated. But maybe I'll just riff on that for a second. So yeah, less about feedback loops, but perhaps a little bit more about the direction in which consultancy can go, because it is admittedly hands held high. It's a path I've taken, but it is one I've tried to kind of go into a more morally ambitious direction. I started off by working on airport expansion, which clearly is pretty terrible for the environment, great for the economy, great for creating jobs, but pretty bad for the environment. And that kind of used to grind on me every morning that that's what I was doing. And then after that point, moving into tech, it was more opportunities, but there was still a consultancy role. And there was more opportunities there to actually go ahead and work with public health systems and hopefully provide, although no doubt still being paid quite well, to actually build systems that could help What did you mean by feedback loops?
So what I mean by feedback loops is the idea that for something to feel or for you to know that it's morally ambitious, you need to close the feedback loop. You need to be able to audit the outcome of your actions. You need to be able to see that it has a positive effect. So an example of that is Joey's, my brother-in-law's partner. She is in data analysis and she's just been volunteering full-time at a charity in Hong Kong that matches orphaned children up to new parents. She was working in the data analytic department. So she was never involved in, taking screaming baby that's been disowned and left and disheveled and handing it over to, doting new parents. That's like owning the feedback loop and getting to feel good. So those people on the front line get to feel really good about it. Her job facilitated it. So it is a morally good thing, but it didn't always feel good to her. And I think that's part of why she quit that volunteering job after only a few months, because her day-to-day existence was actually quite mundane and boring and tedious, and as it had been in the engineering firm she'd been in before.
Okay. Yeah, I actually do have a personal experience of something similar there then in that case. And that was working for NHS Digital a few years ago. I was working on a pilot study for self-service cervical screening. And effectively what it was to help women from a particular background who maybe there's a stigma attached to having cervical screening tests. But anyway, it would post them these self-testing kits in the post, and then they go away, do the test and return it in the post as well at a point in time that was convenient to them and discreet. Now, actually, I had a different experience where I felt actually just seeing the numbers come through and seeing that there was this incredible uptick, that we'd had this hypothesis that maybe we get like 50% of these test kits come back. And actually it turned out to be more like 80% of them came back. So it was like, okay, cool. This is like, it was only a pilot study to see whether it would work or not. But actually to see them come through and be like, okay, like this actually is like a meaningful breakthrough. If we can roll this out at a national level, imagine how many more people could test themselves for cervical cancer and thus get diagnosed early and treatment. So yeah, actually quite the opposite experience. But that feedback loop was really important because like so much of my work is intangible. In terms of we just try to make things better. Yeah.
So moving on to the next point that he goes on to make, Rutger throws a lot of shade at a lot of groups of people who tell themselves they're doing good or think that they're making the world a better place. The next group that are like in the firing line are modern day progressives. And he argues that what they get wrong is that they treat step one of solving a problem as if it is the entire problem, and that awareness is not a solution. If we are to affect meaningful change and do morally good things, somebody has to be doing the doing of the thing. We can't all just be drawing each other's attention to things. That doesn't actually bring things, to a successful point. And I think, an example of this for me is politics. Like, it's so much easier and lighter weight to be a political commentator and say, oh, government should do this, this and this. But nobody wants to put their hands up and put their neck out and get into politics and actually enact it. Like, I think of like Gary Stevenson and his Gary's Economics, wealthy London-based guy who thinks that Westminster should be run differently than it is. He's actually quite near the seat of power. Like, if he really wanted to, walk the walk rather than talk the talk, then he actually could. And maybe that's, a little bit unfair, like maybe he will. But anyway, yeah, I think Rutger's point here is just drawing other people's attention to the problem. That doesn't solve the problem. You then need to create a chain of effective action. You need to show people what they can do, and you need to reality test it. Like, do you have a solution that's actually doable? And can it be enacted by the people you'll bring it to the attention of? And then, so I've added in my own little historical example of this, which is that it wasn't the awareness of the atrocities of the Holocaust that stopped Nazi Germany committing genocide against Jewish people. It was effective action against the perpetrators. The same is true for essentially all tragedies and calamities. Knowing's the first step, and in today's interconnected world, it's a really cheap and easy step. Whilst knowing of a problem is necessary to solve it, it's nowhere near sufficient. It will not be wealthy people gluing themselves to buses that remediate or ameliorate human-driven global heating. It will be technologists, policymakers, capitalists, and essentially everybody who is willing to commit to doing decisive, effective actions to continue to improve the human condition whilst reducing the ecological impact of that. So again, progressives are therefore, in this case, basically examples of people who are extremely moral, but very unambitious. Point three is that you must be agentic, which is quite similar, or the flip side of this. If you don't act on what is right, you cannot claim to have done right. Rutger illustrates this by pointing out a beautiful photo of a proud man failing to partake in a large group salute of Hitler. He allows a sense of awe to wash over the reader before later explaining in more detail how this one dissenter, through his iconic and brave but ultimately futile act of dissent, put his friends and family in enormous amounts of danger from the Nazi secret police and all that, without him then going on to use this moral courage in a productive and effective manner. So basically, you need to decide which box to put yourself into. And the reason why you need to do that is because you're already in one. Your current day-to-day existence, as you listen to this, will fit within one of these boxes outlined, or it might creep across the edges. But indecision is a decision to remain in your current box, or you can make a decision and start doing things that will put you in a different box.
Do you think you could make a difference from inside that box, or do you have to step outside of it? Could you push that box into different directions?
In this 3x2 chart that we're talking about, I guess you can't make a difference that is good whilst remaining in the box. Like, the boxes are fixed in terms of, yeah, you can either say that you take the box with you and you become either more ambitious or more good, but you can't remain, unambitious and bad and make a positive difference. So yeah, is that what you mean?
I just wonder whether. Sorry, I mean more like, say, hey, if the box kind of represents the job or whatever it is you're doing for life, can you drag that in a different direction? Like, maybe you have an enterprise, maybe you're, like you said earlier, like you had maybe one way to be more moralistic or ambitious would be to, say, donate some of your profits to a good cause. Like, it feels like that would be like a way of like not making such a drastic change of like saying, okay, cool, we need to have a complete reset and reconsider which direction we're going in, what I'm doing with my life. Maybe I can just make my current thing a little bit more morally ambitious.
Yeah. So I think, if we were to take a really extreme example, we could sort of make a mockery of that. But so long as you're basically the direction and the scale of the good thing that you're going to sort of bolt on or add on to what you're doing is more strongly good than whatever you're doing for work and with 40 hours a week is strongly bad, then you're right. And so I think, that sort of characterization of that, brave person who's like ultimately, failed to bring down, the Nazi party from within Germany, like, sounds a bit harsh. Like, obviously he lived in a time and a context where being morally good was extremely risky and dangerous in a way that hopefully it's not in a lot of directions now. So yeah, I think I do agree that you bring up a good point, which is often we fail to solve problems because we don't meet them or match them at the same level. With a podcast, we're meeting people where they are on an individual level. To use a podcast to effectively solve very like pan-national, international level problems like climate change, it's never going to work unless everybody listens and the same prescription works for everyone. So I agree, like, each of us has our own constraints put on us about how easy it is to move between these boxes. And we each find ourselves in a different one at the point of learning of this sort of framework of viewing our lives in terms of how moral and how unambitious or ambitious they are. Shall I move on to the next bit that sort of really caught me? He quoted somebody called Margaret Mead, who said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." This, I think, is aimed at addressing that sort of perceived futility of individual action, which he also does by telling the story of the Quakers and other abolitionists who not only managed to get Britain to outlaw slavery back when it was nearly a total global norm, but he also got the British Navy to commit a big part of their fleet to stopping other extractive colonies from doing the same thing. And so basically, it was a small group of committed people with a high ideal, but also effective action that managed to bring about the eventual demise of, this horrible process of exporting humans as if they're cattle in horrifying conditions from West Africa to the slave plantations in the Americas.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to cut in there rather, just because that feels like a good example of somebody making a difference from inside the current system, doesn't it? When you think about it, like, I know these are people from the outside who had managed to convince the British to criminalize slavery and to then use the Navy to enforce that on other powers. But I guess in some sense that is like kind of morphing the existing big system into a forceful good. As opposed to, actually just being the perpetrators, who I suspect they probably were beforehand.
Well, these group of Quakers weren't. I think the conflation there is basically, a real broad brush identity thing, isn't it? Which I think is usually not a very good, effective way of encouraging people to do good things. You can say that British people in the 1800s are bad because British people in the 1800s were massively involved in slavery, but like that's not like detailed enough, is it? That's some people were back when it was culturally normative, and they had all these wild, by modern standards, like myths and fake news about like why this was a good and moral and acceptable thing. And then it took another group of also British people, also around at the same time, who weren't actively engaged in slavery, to point out the obvious contradiction in terms of these, God-fearing Christians that wanted to aspire to live a moral and decent life, who were doing this to other humans. But yeah, you're right. I think systems can be changed from within because systems are comprised of the humans that make up the systems. At least they have been until the age of AI. Anyway, anyway, obviously that's an amazing sort of really powerful example that I don't want to give too much away because, Rutger goes into really interesting detail of, former slaves who bravely and boldly, after sort of educating themselves and displaying that Black people have all of the cognitive capacities and capabilities of white people, would go around and exhibit themselves to amazed crowds of people that had always been told the opposite. And had never had any exposure to sort of rebuke that claim. Anyway, it's really, really quite an interesting and powerful part of the book. Rutger then goes on to spell out some general principles for being effective and brings up the Pareto or 80-20 principle. So Pareto was an Italian trader and gardener, I think it was. And he figured out that I think it was 20% of his toils in his garden produced 80% of the edible produce. And so that's translated into, 80-20 being used almost everywhere for focus on the 20% of effective, worthwhile tasks, and you'll get 80% of your desired outcomes. Anyway, sort of leave the rest of that in the book.
Can we just pause there? Because that is significant. Yeah. I had never heard that. Everyone hears of the 80-20 rule and is applied to so many things. It was an Italian, Italian gardener?
I think he was a trader who just happened to like gardening.
No way. That is incredible. Sorry, I just wanted to really underline that. That's incredible. Good little fact.
Yeah, and then so Rutger Bregman, being a Dutch historian, then goes on to use Dutch history, specifically that of a small town punching way above the national average in terms of offering safe shelter to Jewish people per head of population, to illustrate how we can get people to act in a way, sort of focusing on that 80-20 of like, what is the effective way of making people do morally good? And so he describes the statistical analysis that historians have undertaken on this town. And they asked, were those that signed up to provide shelter to Jewish people more religious or less, more kindly or less, more sociable, or did they have larger houses? And the findings are pretty astounding, really. And then they make perfect sense once you know them. Essentially, the number of rooms in the house was a very small positive predictive factor. The more rooms you had in the house, the more Jewish refugees, internal refugees you would provide shelter to. But the one factor, the only factor other than the number of rooms that mattered, and the one that was much, much bigger, was simply, were you asked or were you not asked? So this town had these two guys basically going around on bicycles advocating for these Jewish refugees and seeking to hide them from the Nazi genocide. And so they'd cycle from home to home, knock on people's doorsteps, they would ask them outright whether they could take a Jewish refugee. They would get the answer, and then they'd go away and come back with a Jewish refugee or family thereof. So it's a really interesting insight. The key for getting these Dutch people to harbour Jewish people was asking them directly. And yeah, I think that's really quite interesting. It's different than raising awareness. It's making a challenge. Are you going to do this thing? Are you going to make a social contract with another human who's asking you to do something that's like unambiguously good? So yeah, really interesting, useful insight, I think. And I was thinking that, we could basically, on a much, much smaller scale, like you can incorporate that into your own life. You could wake up in the morning and say, can I do something that's good today in the mirror? Like just as part of your brushing your teeth practice. It might be better to have your partner ask it or someone else ask it at the end of the day. Say, what did you do that was good? But if you know you're getting the question, then you'll probably do something good, I imagine. But maybe it helps. Maybe part of it was that it was so specific.
What do you think it says about humans that they're willing to step up when they're asked that question?
I think it says that we're social creatures and that perhaps we show our best versions of ourselves to each other. And yeah, I think that really, I think we want the tribe to think well of us, because we've got, that turn of phrase, what is it? It's the savannah brains, medieval institutions and space age technologies, something along the lines of that, eh?
That's
so,
awesome.
Yeah. So I think, just having that other human just level, you look you in the eye and say like, are you going to continue being a bully every day or something like that, then that can sometimes be enough to stop someone doing that. Anyway, so yes, I've tried to incorporate that a little bit myself, not of sheltering refugees, not that ambitious, but of confronting myself with what could you do that's morally good each morning, and what did you do that was morally good each evening. And the findings, the sort of report is that basically it's really embarrassing when you don't have an answer. Therefore you either reflect positively on something that you did do that was good, which is great. That's basically, I guess, a bit of mindfulness and a bit of, positive reflection on something that was good, which is a good thing. Or you realize you don't have anything, and then you're like, well, I need to shape up because I'm going to ask myself this at the same time tomorrow night. So yeah, and for me, it's been like quite small, unambitious things. So for example, like I use my phone a lot of the time, but not for its intended purpose to call someone and speak to someone I care about and or who I know is socially isolated. So it's just using that thing more effectively in my downtime. And sometimes it's, going out and making small gestures that I wouldn't otherwise have thought to do. Anyway, yeah, so there's no real status or prestige because it's just me. But yeah, it's still quite effective, probably more effective if you have somebody else ask you. Anyway, Rutger goes on to speculate about animal suffering and all that the large-scale industrial farming does. And he suggests that essentially once you could buy a lab-grown steak or whatever it is, like vat-grown steak for the same price, same taste and same nutrition, then suddenly it's going to become a lot easier for people to make the moral standpoint that modern farming practices are harmful and there's lots of animal suffering. So this is basically him going back to that effective action principle and basically saying, scientists and technologists, when they make new discoveries that fuel good change and positive moral impact, they do a lot more than the people banging the drum asking for that change. And so he then goes on to throw shade at another group, and that's the modern environmentalists who basically refrain from doing anything, who try and just reduce their carbon footprint to almost zero, and don't want to have any stake in the future of humanity or society, and they don't want to reproduce because they think that's a terrible thing as well. And he describes it as aiming to have never existed, which is pretty freaking hardcore, I think. But we probably, I don't know, probably know of someone like that in which, so they swear off doing almost anything, essentially. And he points out that essentially we know that this is not going to be an effective strategy and therefore it's not worth pursuing because global heating is proceeding at such a pace that even if everyone stopped reproducing now, then the damage that we're likely to inflict before those that are alive today are gone will still cause this massive ecological devastation, which I think is quite interesting because quite often I think we're motivated by behaviors we can pat ourselves on the back for more than behaviors that actually make a genuine sort of measurable difference on scales that are beyond our comprehension or fully understanding. Yes, it's quite interesting because he's so positive and upbeat and happy, clappy, and smiley, and then he just ruthlessly eviscerates what he thinks, like, I think, is sort of moral ineptitude. Anyway, yeah, really interesting. He then goes on to sort of outline the idea of there being different traits amongst the population of sort of leaders, early adopters, late adopters, and then just sort of total laggard sheep who'll just go where the pack's gone already. And he quotes this psychologist called Cass Sunstein, who has a framework for this, in which he divides the world into zeros, ones, twos, and millions, and which is to do with your personal predilection for taking action at potential personal expense. And so those people that stuck their neck out and said, we shouldn't be involved in the slave trade, like, they were initially mocked and derided, and people would, slam them in the papers and talk smack about them or just laugh them out the room, basically, which is pretty hard to imagine now that I guess the sort of cultural zeitgeist has thankfully moved in a much better direction. But that was in large part because of them. So yeah, really, really interesting framework that there are these zeros, ones, twos, and millions. And he uses it to explain this optimism of, you might feel like you're right, but you're too early. But this framework can explain why momentum can grow quite what seems like exponentially. Some people just are transgressive by their nature. They're troublemakers and disruptors. They're the zeros. Others like a bit of novelty, adventure, and sort of a bit of acting out, but maybe need a holding hand. These are ones and twos. And most of the population are more like sheep. And with some of us likely to follow the trend a bit sooner and some of us a bit later. So those are the millions. I think it's a really interesting frame. I think, again, yeah, it's just trying to G you up and say, if you're right about something and if it is good and if it does need doing, then get on and start doing it. And you don't know sort of when this like exponential sort of snowball might turn into an avalanche, or, raindrop might turn into a typhoon, or whatever it is. I wish he'd kind of gone a bit deeper, because he was talking about a psychologist, about whether or not that psychologist had explored whether we can increase or decrease our propensity to initiate effective action. I don't know if millions can become zeros, or if that's just too far apart, but can a two become a one, and all that. But anyway, he just offers it up as encouragement, essentially, to get involved in worthy causes, even if the current scale of the movement seems like a barrier to success, which is an interesting one. It's a little bit sort of contrary to maybe what he said in the previous sections about, you need to sort of be effective, because actually, if you put your shoulder to the wheel, but the wheel's really, really bloody big and you're the only person pushing, then sometimes the wheel just doesn't move. So anyway, I also think that probably goes back to this, like, human herd tribal mentality thing. Like, I think being a zero is just harder. Just because you are a zero doesn't mean you're right, and doesn't mean that you're doing something good. It just means that you're standing apart, and standing apart is scary and comes with risks. So I think for me, the message here is, well, most people are not zeros by their sort of natural inclination. If you have it in you to be a zero, be careful about when you're going to do it, and go after something that you think is significant and solvable. And by design, if you are being a zero, then it's significant, solvable, and unaddressed or ignored by others. Else you wouldn't be being a zero, you'd be being a million. Anyway, the next important question he asks is moral ambition a contagious frame of mind? And to what extent are we all influenced by mimetic desire, or the urge just to act like those around us? In the same way that, like, one of the strongest predictors for how old your car is how old is your neighbor's car. And the strongest predictor of whether you have solar panels on your roof is, does your neighbor have solar panels on the roof? Is moral ambition contagious? I'm going to borrow one of my own examples to leave some of Rutger's in his book. And it's the founding of the outdoor clothing companies Patagonia and the North Face. The story starts back in the 50s and 60s with Yvonne Chouinard, who will go on to found Patagonia, and Doug Tompkins, who will go on to found the North Face and the fashion brand Esprit with his then wife. They were two Californian dirtbag climbers that lived cheaply in vans and climbed all day in a counterculture that rejected consumerism and embraced nature. In 1964, aged 21, Doug Tompkins and then wife Susie founded the North Face. He sold it a few years later and co-founded another massive fashion brand, Esprit. Yvonne kept on climbing, and being a blacksmith by trade, he began making his own climbing gear, pitons and carabiners, and selling them under his own name. Then he became troubled by the damage that his steel pitons were doing to the rock faces he was climbing, and those that were being climbed by the climbers he'd sold his products to. So he discontinued his most popular product in favor of less damaging aluminium pitons. This birthed Patagonia, which has then become this massive clothing company. This happened in 1973, 9 years after his good buddy founded the North Face. Yvonne had followed Doug's entrepreneurial lead and would continue to do so as Patagonia grew into the global clothing company that it is today, all the while trying to operate under a philosophy of cause no unnecessary harm and use fashion to inspire and implement environmental solutions. They've pioneered lifelong clothing repairs and sustainable materials, and Yvonne has got Patagonia certified as a B Corporation and given away ownership to a non-profit and trust designed to ensure all profits go to planetary protection. There's pretty awesome and inspiring and influential stuff. Perhaps Yvonne's moral example influenced Doug. Well, Doug went on to sell all his business interests, moved to Chile, and has bought millions of acres of wild land and created enormous national parks. And so I think the question is here, what are the odds of two good friends both founding and developing international billion-dollar clothing companies? Well, they're a lot higher if one of them's already done it. And we could also ask, what are the odds of two good friends both doing morally ambitious things? A lot higher if one of them's already done it. Why? Could be a combination of achievable, attainable role modeling, transferring of practical knowledge, insights, and even capital. But the point here is that if we decide to tend and cultivate our friendship gardens by associating with others that help us to do good things and be a version of ourselves that we feel is good, then we put ourselves in a much better position for doing worthwhile stuff than if we repeatedly associate with good time Charlies that are fun to be around, but don't seem to like themselves very much, and we don't like ourselves for what we've done whilst we were in their presence.
It's pretty powerful stuff. I had absolutely no idea that these two were friends, or that even the North Face was doing all these like positive things. Patagonia's famous for its positive impact, but I didn't realize the North Face, well, at least the money that he's made from the North Face has gone to such good causes.
Yeah. So the North Face isn't, I think it's owned by private equity now. It's the founder and what he's chosen to do with his money. Anyway, I think it's really telling that essentially we are a reflection of those who we choose to surround ourselves with. And it's just a really nice example of that. Then Rutger goes back into a bit of motivation, and he points out that actually, changing the world can be quite selfish. Like, it doesn't have to be a selfless act. Doing something morally ambitious allows you to like and respect yourself, which is great. And it can also be financially rewarding by bringing new technologies or whatever it is, big, profound change that people want to be a part of, then it can do that. And I would go on to say, in Rutger Bregman's case and that of his publishers, it can also deliver fame, social recognition, which are inducements that are making people go the other way and picking less ambitious or less moral vocations. Anyway, he goes on to sort of talk about focusing on what you're good at. And he uses this famous American example, this guy called Ralph Nader, who was basically the spearhead of the successful campaign for a seatbelt law. And he's estimated to have therefore saved 3.5 million lives in the US alone. And he did it by writing slamming reviews of the Chevrolet Corvair, a car that he asserted was designed to kill its driver, and publishing them in newspapers. So this is a guy that basically just used what he was good at to affect change. And then it kind of all came tumbling down. In the early 2000s, the same guy ran for president as the Green Party candidate, and he split the left progressive vote in Florida by taking almost 100,000 votes, and Bush beat Al Gore in Florida by 537 votes to give him the presidency. So really interesting that basically like the same guy with the same set of skills, just employed differently in different domains, being a really good writer, when he employed it to get industrial action and to have it recognized that these cars are unsafe and it's a better way of doing things, it worked. When he employed it to try and become president of the United States, the person that he was most aligned with ended up losing to the person he was least aligned with. You could easily imagine that because he was left of the left leading Democrats, more of his 100,000 votes would have gone to Al Gore than they would have gone to Bush, who's further right in the Republicans. Interesting. And then the problem or the critique here was essentially he held on to the playbook that worked well as a disruptive outsider, and when he was a big established name on the inside. That's interesting. And then Rutger goes on to list some important myths or fallacies associated with ineffective social change or ineffective moral ambition. Again, he comes back to awareness being insufficient because most of us don't always act on our beliefs. So we have this thing called the belief behavior gap or the value action gap. And you need to essentially account for that. So if you just change somebody's belief, unless you can also lead them through the actions, then that is insufficient, essentially. And so I've actually forgotten if this was my example or his. Oh, no, it's his. In 2019, a meta-analysis study found that around 40 to 70% of all donated medical devices are useless in that when they're received by the place they've been donated to, they're either faulty, ineffective, don't run on the local electricity, or the staff lack the training to use them. So this is, you need to audit whether your project is actually going to have the desired effect and cancel it if it isn't. And then he gives this wonderful example of this American charity called No Lean Season that were aiming to basically improve poverty levels of Bangladeshi farmers by giving them money in the off season when you can't grow food. It was all about trying to reduce poverty levels in these Bangladeshi farmers. And No Lean Season had this out of season thing that they did, and I think it was give money. And then they basically ran an audit of whether it was helping these farmers, and they found that it wasn't, and then they disestablished their entire charity off the back of that. So I think it's really interesting. Yeah, so allying yourself to a cause, bringing a unique skill set and tools, whatever you have with you, whether it's time, money, energy, whatever, or your profession and what skills you've got through that is really good. But you've also got to audit whether your intentions and the actions that come off the back of that are actually having the desired effect. Really interesting. And then he goes on about an obsessive focus on purity within certain charitable organizations. And he talks about somebody quitting a charity because it seemed as if it was investing too much of its time, energy, and resource into cultivating internal purity at the expense of getting its good shit done, basically. And then he also talks about the possibility and opportunity of building alliance with seemingly differing opinioned people. And he's got this quite powerful story of a animal rights activist in the US that basically meets and befriends people that run these really intensive barn egg chicken farms. So laying farms rather than chicken for meat purposes. And they essentially end up becoming allies in an unexpected way because they both see the suffering of these creatures, and it's not really what the chicken farmer had signed up for either, and he's sort of kind of over the barrel with a big poultry corporation that basically owns his ass. So anyway, if you can relax your standards on sort of purity of people that you could ally with, then the group of allies expands massively, and therefore your chances at effective action and success go up. Okay, thoughts?
I'm actually building that one. So this company, Alveol, I used to work for them, and just an example of the kind of partnering with allies that you maybe wouldn't expect. The whole premise of this business was to put beehives on people's roofs, and the idea was to do something morally positive, which was to bring people closer to nature, and so they could have nature positive experiences, and then that would impact them in their lives going forward. Now, the interesting thing was they started off with lots of schools. That's a nice way of doing it, but they soon realized that really to kind of afford massive expansion, they'd have to partner with somebody with a little bit more money. So they ended up partnering with corporate real estate firms to put these beehives on top of these huge downtown skyscrapers. And the whole thing there was they had to partner with those big corporate real estate companies that have offices and big buildings across all of these major cities in North America, as opposed to just individual school boards working in different districts, and actually being able to then give them the fuel to have that positive impact across so many different places. And it's incredible to think that I guess there's two things there. It's one thing, finding an ally who you wouldn't expect, which was these corporate real estate companies. That certainly wasn't the plan when it started. And secondly as well, I think it just underlines really it's surprising how you can and turn, in their case, a skill, which was beekeeping, into like a vehicle for providing like really positive change and amplifying it, across many, many cities. So yeah, anyway, just a kind of reflection, particularly on that partnering point, because the founders of this company had no experience dealing with corporate real estate companies. It was only when they started knocking on the doors, asking for them to do it, then actually they started to build these contacts.
Yeah, that's a really good example, actually. And also quite a good segue into the next bit, actually, because that was whilst you're out in Canada. The next part of the story explores essentially becoming more effective as a morally ambitious person. And it tracks the story of a young Canadian who moved to London to set up a charity with his then partner. And he didn't really have any money. He's a really analytical, sort of nerdy data sciencey guy, probably a man after your heart. Who wanted to employ like a deep analytical sort of economist's boring, bland approach to having meaningful impact, and was planning to found a charity. And he did a lot of research, and he was going back to those things that I spoke about earlier, that it's got to be solvable, significant, and ignored by others who would be better placed to have that impact. And he basically decided what he needed to do was, given he had basically no money but loads of time and energy as a young guy out of university, was he needed to go to India and using the prevailing technology at the time, which was text out reminders to new mothers about the importance of getting their babies immunized. So he did that, and it was really good. And he realized something that was pretty interesting, that was essentially, what he'd done is he hadn't brought any of his own preconceptions about what was morally good into the equation. Like, that hadn't been his intention going in. He needed something that was good, that mattered, a problem that needed solving, that was solvable, and that was being ignored by other people. And so he's gone on to found this charity school of entrepreneurship in London. And through that, he's mentored other charities that have had much bigger impacts than him and his charity, including a charity that did the same thing, but for fortifying vitamins and minerals into cereal products in India again. And that's because I think basically the number of people that you can reach and the value of a pound or a US dollar goes a lot further in India. So when you're doing that sort of economic, hard science approach to moral good, you go for where you get more bang for your buck, essentially. Really interesting and really cool to know that it's there. And I think that's sort of the model on which Rutger Bregman has founded his own school of moral ambition. And then to sort of draw that a chapter to a close, Rutger Bregman quotes a British philosopher, Bertrand Russell, who said this: "The mark of a good man is one who can read a page of numbers and weep." On this, I've come to agree just wholeheartedly. I think it's such a skill and it's one that's worth cultivating. It's hard and it needs practice. We've spoken in the past about how we understand the world through story, not through data. And, there's that quote that was either said by Stalin or misattributed to him or whatever, that one death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. You need to reframe that is 1 million one deaths. That's 1 million people who are, a brother, mother, cousin, whatever it is, to all the people around them. It is one death, and the tragedy of that multiplied by 1 million. So, it's hard, isn't it? Because 1 million is such an abstract, massive concept.
It was like during COVID, they'd publish every day. They'd say 100,000 people have died today from COVID, from coronavirus. And it became very quickly, you would become numb to that. You're right. We need to strive to not forget the fact that would be 100,000 people a day who are brothers, husbands, wives, sisters, parents to other people, and their lives matter significantly just on an individual level.
Yeah. I think it's really big. One needs to have the humility. I need to have the humility to basically say, right, I'm not treating these numbers with the fair dinkum gravity they deserve. That's massive. That is, I resonate to the thing that I've seen or I've connected with or that's, tugged on the heartstrings. But the real suffering or the real opportunity for improvement and betterment is in the numbers, essentially. And so building on that, Rutger ramps it up and introduces me to a new analytical approach for moral ambition that he's using that draws on the baseball scouting term value over replacement player, or VORP. So VORP in baseball scouting is basically looking at your current roster, the players you've already got available, who you've got sat on your bench. And when you're going to scout a new player, you compare them to who's on your bench already. So you could have a really great batter who's really 100% what you're looking for. But if what's on your bench is like, a lot of 97s and 96s, then it could be a very different position that actually you want to bring into the team and make a big difference. So I think that's goes into that solvable, significant, and underaddressed, undervalued by others framework. When you're trying to be both moral and ambitious, you do need to kind of say, what can I do that others can't, or what talent do I have that I can bring to a club or a team that's sort of lacking in my talent, rather than just becoming an extra member of an organization that already has a surplus of people that can do the thing that you can do.
Yeah, I think one of the other things to think about there is like, or to kind of, I guess, illustrate this is like, in your current role, this is something I think about anyway, is like in your current role, whether you're an accountant, whether you're a marketer, whether you're a software engineer, whatever it is you do, there's always going to be these teams called companies or organizations or charities or public bodies that will be looking out for those skills. And sometimes you might be able to attach your skills to a problem that they are trying to solve. And so long as it actually is solvable and is trying to take on an overlooked problem, then perhaps that's the way to become more morally ambitious, particularly if you're looking for a degree of like finance or security, if you do have wider responsibilities and don't want to completely start from scratch again. But yeah, anyway, sorry, I just thought that's an interesting point.
No, it's really, really good point. And I think also on the wanting to have financial security, this is definitely not about lambasting people for that. I think it does seem like most of the philanthropists or people that are giving up their time and devoting them to morally good causes are the ones that have either figured out how to get paid to do it sufficiently well that they can afford that which they would want themselves in life. And often partly what they do is they are able to dampen down how expensive their lifestyle is, or they're the ones that have already done the other thing and made buckets of money and now have the wonderful, immense privilege, joy of being able to spend their time pursuant of other goals. They might be higher goals, they might be personal self-interested goals. Obviously, in the case of a philanthropist, they would sort of be talking about, I guess, a higher goal, as opposed to, how many laps of the world can I do on my super yacht or whatever. Or even, maybe some of the most effective philanthropists in the world are maybe doing both at the same time. So I'm not saying don't be financially ambitious. Definitely do that. I think there's lots of good that can come from that and plenty of bad that can come from not doing that. I think it's morally good to pay your own way if you can, because then you're freeing up resource, you're paying tax, you're contributing to helping provide for those that can't, simply through, like you said, just earning the amount of money you need to be able to sustain your life, because you're going to pay quite a lot of tax on that. Yeah. And then I just wrote a few notes about how one could, what skills one might have to employ, but this is kind of, you covered off on this, but if you're a student, you've got a lot of free time, energy and idealism. Those can be assets. They really can be useful, particularly to organizations that don't have them. If you're a captain of industry and you've got, 6 adorable darlings and a partner at home, and, they fill up every waking minute of your life when you're not at work, then, capital or money might be your most effective contribution to morally ambitious causes. And that could be, it could be charitable donations, or it could just be doing an audit of your financial situation and say, how much of this money is like indirectly invested in things that I think are bad? And could I instead invested into things that I think will make money, but are also good? Going back to Rutger's point that, it can be selfish. That wouldn't necessarily be selfish. You might be actually losing out on the best possible returns and gains, but anyway, you might not be. And then so that basically wraps up my review of Rutger Bregman's moral ambition. I'm focusing mostly on the sort of utility of the philosophical agenda he pushes. That if we do not do something morally good, I mean, that's a big point actually, is that something that I've missed out on is the concept of opportunity cost, that there are lots of talented, smart people who aren't in the bad category, but they are in the neutral category. And that if we could motivate more of them to get into the good category, the world would be a better place. So yeah, he's talking about, if we do not do something morally good, we'll lack meaning, and that meaning's important, and that most of us have the talents and skills requisite to do something good. So that's it really. I'd recommend reading his book. I really enjoyed it, and yeah, I found the historical anecdotes really interesting, and his slamming rebukes of other people who would see themselves as morally good, but that he thinks are being ineffective, as quite whimsical actually, but also quite insightful. And then I've written a quick 5-step playbook for making your life morally ambitious. Do you want to hear it?
Fill me in.
So step 1 is redefine success to include moral good or making other lives better, and then valuing this alongside salary and security. And once certain important thresholds have been met in your own safety and circumstance, then you might move it ahead of salary and security. To do this, ask yourself the following: who benefits from what I do? How much do they benefit? Can I make a bigger benefit for each person or scale the number of people I reach? Step 2. Choose problems that are worth solving and that you can personally contribute meaningfully to. These are the sizable, solvable, and overlooked problems. List your skills or assets that you're willing to deploy for moral good. Ask yourselves, are others employing these more effectively? And interrogate your favorite causes to ask whether they are sizable, solvable, and overlooked. If so, great, proceed. If they're not sizable enough, shoot for something that matters more. If it's not solvable with today or tomorrow's technologies, shelve it and come back to it, or bring that technology into existence if that seems plausible within your skill set. And if other organizations that are better resourced are already covering it, can you join them and add to them meaningfully? Or are they all good without you? In which case, that's great. You'll just have to find another arena to do good in. Step 3 is join a moral network. We are what we repeatedly do, and we do what those around us are doing. You will sustain more courage to do good things by associating with like-minded people. So do that. Ask, can I meet real people and have impactful dialogue leading to action in the flesh? You could email a prospective mentor, respond to a flyer on a neighborhood notice board, or failing a local group, you could get online and find an online group of like-minded individuals working on the same problem. Step 4, embrace imperfect idealism. Here, so often, perfect is the enemy of good. If you think it important to stop factory farming, you'll likely be better placed to achieve this by allying with some people who currently prop up the industry than excluding them from your efforts. If you want to stop global warming, holding interesting, good faith conversations with people responsible for lots of the pollution is likely to be important. If you seal yourself off from people who have power, if differently directed to you, then you're shooting yourself in the foot. Step 5, make doing good a hobby or a habit, not a one-time decision. It's easy to feel motivated to do something off the back of an inspiring read or an interesting podcast. Make it a habit instead. A regular action will allow you to increase A, the moral good you do, and B, your felt capacity to do more, by proving to yourself that you can reliably, repeatedly integrate morally good actions into your life.
Bang on. Okay. I feel like we've solved all of the world's problems, or at least if we start to, if someone was listening, we could push people towards being more morally ambitious. But really
then hopefully we could
book.
ask them to solve all the problems. Yeah, it was a really interesting book. Yeah,
yeah. Then we are purely the politicians raising awareness. But no, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I feel like the kind of key take home for me was actually, true success can be using our own skills to address these urgent, solvable, and overlooked problems. I feel
it was
like
actually sizable, solvable, and overlooked, but urgent is that should be part of it, shouldn't it?
I suppose you're right. Yeah.
Although, I guess there's a counter argument there that actually, if it's lower urgency, then it's perhaps more likely to be overlooked.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I feel like the overlooked part of the equation is kind of a bit of a wrench because the world's big enough that somebody will have always considered pretty much every solvable or important problem that needs to be addressed. So I wonder if there's like a if that's a slightly intimidating label to put on that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think that it doesn't need to be, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to found your own organization that's doing something new and differently morally good. But you don't want to put yourself into competition with somebody who's just way more capable of doing that thing way better. So I don't know, like an example would be like you, single, individual, autonomous, wonderful human, don't want to like take on the WHO food program where they're working. You might want to provide food for people who need it where they're not currently receiving it from the WHO, World Food Program.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good way of reframing it, actually. That would be otherwise overlooked by a WHO World Food Program. So yeah, cool. Nice one. There we go. Okay, so that's the take home then, isn't it? We should all try to strive to solve sizable, solvable, and overlooked problems. We can do so not only by quitting our jobs and having a complete change of direction. There are many different ways we can do that. Perhaps like we could start thinking about what the problems are that we'd like to spend our 40 working years of our lives trying to solve. Questioning what ambition are we chasing now, whether it's moral or personal. So what do you think? Do we think what we're doing is having a moral impact? Do we lack a degree of moral ambition? Are we just going through the notions and in that neutral zone? And finally, if you could apply your existing skills to something bigger, what would that look like? And just to underline again, your existing skill, I honestly believe could be your day job. Just positioning it in a way that is aimed at something bigger and better. So to conclude then, moral ambition is about trying to solve sizable, solvable, and overlooked problems. That may or may not require you to reposition and rethink what you're doing with your life. As Rutger says, it's about using your skills to address those problems. So maybe you are an accountant, maybe you are a software engineer, maybe you are a lawyer. Perhaps you could reuse those skills in an organization that is taking on a morally ambitious challenge. So yeah, I think it's worth thinking about, worth reflecting on. Is there a problem that you'd like to spend your 40 years of working trying to address? And yeah, good luck, be well, and get after it.